June 29, 1944, 05:03. Hours outskirts of St. Lo. Normandy, the morning mist had not yet lifted from the sunken lanes of the French countryside. Dew clung to the hedgerows like beads of cold sweat, and the distant rumble of artillery rolled across the fields like muted thunder. In the grey light, the land seemed suspended in a breath before violence, a stillness so complete that even the birds had gone silent. Inside a mud-splattered M4 Sherman, engine growling low like a caged animal, Staff Sergeant William Harlan ran a gloved hand across the condensation forming on the periscope glass. The inside of the turret smelled of oil, sweat, and cordite, the permanent perfume of armored warfare. Somewhere on the other side of the fog lay Panzer IVs, the steel predators of this battlefield, their high-velocity guns known to punch through Sherman armor as if it were tin. The crew said little. In these quiet pre-combat minutes, words were useless. Harlan, the commander, Foster, the gunner, Levine, the loader, Riker on the radio, and Dale, the driver. They sat in a silence that was not peace, but rather acceptance. A silence of men who knew that statistically, 1 in 3 Sherman crews never made it out once the Panzers opened fire. The radio crackled with static. All units, hold your position. Do not advance. Armor recon confirms enemy armor movement. Panzer Division expected within the hour. You are to maintain corridor control. Repeat, hold position. Riker lifted his headset and glanced at Harlan. The words hung heavy, heavier than the tank's armor itself. Hold position. For an infantry platoon, those words meant dig in. For a tank crew, it meant death if the enemy struck from a superior angle. Foster, the gunner, muttered under his breath, not loud enough for the commander to hear clearly, but enough that the others caught it. Hold position. Against Panzers, that's not an order. That's a sentence. Harlan didn't respond. His eyes, tired beyond his 26 years, scanned the hedgerow through the slit of armored glass. He had learned over the past weeks that Normandy was not a battlefield. It was a maze, and every hedgerow was a blind corner where death could be waiting with a crosshair. Somewhere out in the fog, a sharper sound cut through the distant artillery. Track movement, heavy, metallic, too refined to be a Sherman. The crew stiffened. Foster's hand hovered near the elevation wheel of the 75mm gun. Then the sound stopped. Not faded, stopped, as if the enemy had frozen to listen. A long second passed, then another, and then impact. The first shell hit somewhere to their left, a dull metallic clang followed by a shower of earth and stone that slammed against the Sherman's hull like hail. Dale instinctively flinched, hands white on the controls. Levine's stomach lurched. Riker let out a short, involuntary sound, a half-laugh, half-shock reaction. Direct engagement had begun. Over the radio, another unit screamed something unintelligible, a burst of static. Then a distant explosion cut them off. Somewhere in the hedgerow network, another Sherman had just been hit. Whether knocked out or burning, no one could tell. Inside Harlan's tank, time became slower, heavier. Breaths became measured. Muscles tightened. Down in the driver's seat, Dale heard it first. A deep, grinding clatter of armored treads, closer now, moving with deliberate confidence. Panzer confidence. A second shell cut through the fog. This one closer, throwing a shock wave that rattled the periscope and made the entire Sherman groan under the concussion. The sound of metal under stress, that unmistakable howl of a tank hit too close for comfort, echoed across the lane. Harlan finally spoke, voice level, painfully calm. Gunner, eyes on left ridge. Loader, ready AP, stay tight. But the fog was too thick. Foster scanned, but there was nothing but shifting gray and the faint silhouette of hedgerows closing in like walls. Then it happened. A glint of something dark and angular beyond the mist. A turret turning, Levine's voice cracked. "Panzer! Left! Traversing!" Foster rotated the gun, heart hammering, but their angle was wrong. The Sherman's forward arc couldn't line up without exposing the entire hull. Holding position meant staying forward-facing. But that forward face was now nothing but a target plate. Harlan knew it. He recognized the problem instantly, not just tactically, but mechanically. He had once worked in a machinist's shop. He understood angles, surfaces, vectors of impact, and right now, everything about their position was wrong. Outside, the fog thinned for only a second, just enough to see the Panzer IV's side profile turning, its commander likely scanning for the telltale rounded silhouette of a Sherman hull to finish the kill. The crew waited for a command. Any command, but none came. Not from battalion, not from infantry support, not from the doctrine written in ink by men far from this field, and in that split second of suspended breath, the truth became clear to Sergeant Harlan. Orders would not save them. Movement would. His hand gripped the turret edge, knuckles white. Before the war turned him into a tank commander driving through the hedgerows of Normandy, William Harlan had never imagined a battlefield. His world had once been defined by the rhythm of machinery, the measured clank of metal under pressure, the hiss of steam from hydraulic arms, and the scent of hot iron at the Cincinnati railworks, where he worked as an apprentice machinist. He was the kind of man who noticed the way gears meshed, how a misaligned bearing could change the entire motion of a machine. While others saw only steel, he saw momentum, friction, the hidden language of mechanical force. Men around him in the shop joked that Harlan didn't speak much, because he was busy listening to the machines instead. War, in 1941, was something distant, a thing printed in newspapers with black and white photos of Europe in flames. He'd pause sometimes during lunch breaks as the radio in the workshop crackled through news bulletins. German armor sweeping Poland, French lines broken, Soviet columns burning in the snow. But to him and the others, it was just noise carried on the hum of industry. Until Pearl Harbor. The day the factory sirens changed tone, long, continuous, almost mournful, he knew something had shifted. Within 3 weeks, the rail works was converted to produce armored components and ammunition crates. Draft notices arrived in thick envelopes. Men who had once argued about socket wrenches and steel composition were suddenly talking about enlistment, duty, and armored divisions heading to a place called North Africa. Harlan didn't rush to volunteer. He wasn't built from the romantic myth of the eager patriot. His decision came quieter. On a night when he stood alone in the factory yard, watching sparks fly from a cutting torch, as if pieces of the world were being burned away, reshaped into something harder. He walked into the recruiter's office the next morning, grease still on his hands. When he was assigned to the 3rd Armored Division, they asked about his mechanical background. He expected maintenance duty. Instead, they placed him in armored school, handed him a manual thicker than any book he had read, and pointed him toward an M4 Sherman. The first time he sat inside the tank, smelling the same oil and steel scent he knew from the workshop, something clicked. Not pride, not excitement, something more practical, understanding. Tanks, like machines, had personalities. Shermans were noisy, stubborn things. They rattled, overheated, complained through every gear shift. But they moved. Fast. Faster than they had any right to. He trained in Tennessee fields, then in English countryside mud, learning how to angle armor for ricochet, how to feel the moment a track might slip, how to sense a mechanical fault by vibration alone. Instructors spoke doctrine. Harlan listened, but more importantly, he tested. If something didn't make sense mechanically, he made a note. Not for rebellion, for survival. The other men in his crew came from entirely different worlds. Foster had been a dock worker in Boston, fast-talking and sharp-eyed. Levine once studied art before the draft claimed him. Riker drove buses in Detroit. Dale was a farmhand from Kansas, who measured everything by soil and distance between fences. And yet, inside the Sherman, they became parts of a single machine, each man's movement linked to another's, like gears, like pressure plates. During a lull in training exercises in England, Harlan once told Dale, the driver, "A tank isn't meant to hold still. Metal that doesn't move breaks." Dale nodded, not understanding fully, but remembering. Those words would echo later in Normandy, when orders told them to hold position against approaching panzers. War was coming, and Harlan, the machinist who once believed in angles more than orders, would soon discover that outthinking death required more than obedience. It required motion, even when command demanded stillness. The maps laid out on the hood of the command jeeps looked clean, clinical, a network of lanes, hedgerows, and villages marked with neat pencil strokes. But out in the fields beyond St. Lo, nothing was neat. The land itself was a trap, carved from centuries of French farming. Each field boxed in by thick earthen hedgerows, 6 feet high, roots tangled like wire, impossible for infantry to see over, deadly for tanks that had to crest them blindly, exposing their bellies to whatever waited beyond. To American planners, Normandy had seemed like open ground after the beaches. They expected momentum, armored thrusts like Patton's desert maneuvers. What they found instead was a chessboard of green walls, each one a potential ambush site. German doctrine adapted faster. Panzer IVs and Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns were positioned to use the hedgerow angles as natural firing lanes. Their orders were simple: do not duel. High-velocity 75mm guns. A single well-positioned panzer could knock out 3 Shermans before the column even located its shooter. American doctrine, by contrast, was still rooted in forward assault. Tank crews were drilled to maintain formation, keep the gun facing front, and advance through the corridor, trusting infantry to clear the flanks. But in the tight hedgerow lanes, infantry support often fell behind, tangled in undergrowth or pinned by machine gun nests. And so, by the time of the St. Lo push, U.S. armored crews were being sent into kill corridors, asked to hold ground in lanes where visibility extended no more than 30 yards ahead. 3 days before Harlan's crew took position in that lane, a meeting had been held at the divisional staff tent. A colonel had outlined the objective in precise terms. You will secure and maintain corridor access here. Armor will hold until infantry can stabilize the flanks. A junior officer, one of the few who had actually been down a lane under fire, had tried to speak. "Sir, a Sherman holding still is—" The colonel cut him off without raising his voice. "Doctrine says armor supports infantry by holding ground until infantry relieves it. That is the doctrine. We are not revising it in the field." That single line, delivered with quiet authority, sealed the fate of dozens of crews who would soon learn that doctrine did not account for German initiative. Panzer IV 4EH models, the very ones rumored to be moving toward St. Lo, had thick frontal armor, 80mm of hardened steel. Shermans, with their 75mm guns, had a chance to penetrate only from the sides or rear, and even then at close range. To achieve that angle, a crew would have to move, rotate, withdraw, or flank. But command orders were clear. Do not maneuver out of formation. Do not expose the flanks. Do not reverse without radio confirmation. And radio confirmation rarely came in time. Thus, by that June morning, the battlefield conditions were these. Terrain favored German armor. Doctrine favored immobility. Communication was slow, often failing in fog or artillery. Shock. The enemy expected American tanks to behave like predictable machines, and that expectation became their confidence. Panzer commanders believed, with reason, that Sherman crews would hold position until they were killed. Some even joked in their field notes that American tanks seemed to accept death with formal discipline, refusing to leave their assigned lanes even as rounds tore through their hulls. It was into this strategic cage, this collision between doctrine and terrain, that Harlan's Sherman rolled. And it was here, in a corridor where orders said hold and survival whispered move, that one reverse maneuver would break more than just formation. It would fracture doctrine itself. For a few long heartbeats, nothing moved. The Sherman sat in the lane like a static target, exactly how doctrine intended. Gun forward, infantry assumed on the flanks, engine idling low to avoid giving away position. The fog lay heavy, deadening sound, making distance impossible to judge. Then, through the periscope glass, a faint shape shifted on the left ridge. Not movement, a silhouette, angular, boxy, German, a Panzer IV turret. Turning in deliberate predatory rotation, Foster saw it too, jaw tightening as his hands tightened on the elevation wheel. Turret traverse. Left. 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 The Panzer stopped its rotation. Its gun locked into position, a hunter settling on its shot. Over the headset came the calm, final confirmation from battalion. All armor, enemy bearing confirmed. Hold position. Do not reposition or reverse without direct clearance. Infantry elements en route. Hold corridor control. Hold. That word again. The Panzer's muzzle flashed a fraction of a second before the sound hit. A white jet of smoke erupted from the hedgerow. The shell cut the air with a screaming velocity, a banshee howl of metal, and struck the ground just short of the Sherman, the blast rocking the tank like a ship hit by a rogue wave. Levine flinched. Riker swore under his breath. Dale's boot hovered just above the accelerator, waiting for permission that would never come. Harlan's heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. In that moment, his mind wasn't on fear, it was on angles. A Panzer firing from a rising left flank meant its gun depression was limited. If he reverse-angled the Sherman, using the ditch as a pivot point, he could force the Panzer to over-rotate, exposing its side armor for a split second. Doctrinally, it was insanity. Mechanically, it was sound. No manual approved it. No training scenario taught it. It was a machinist's instinct applied to tank combat. Harlan placed his hand on Dale's shoulder. Driver. Dale didn't look back. His eyes stayed forward, knuckles white on the controls. Say it, Bill! Say it and we go! A second Panzer shell screamed past, clipping the hedgerow, showering the Sherman in mud and shattered wood. German gunners were walking their shots inward. They had the range now, hold position and die. Or move and break formation, break orders, break doctrine. Harlan exhaled once, not a breath of fear, but a breath of decision. His voice, when it came, was low. Controlled. Driver. Full reverse. Now. There was no dramatic music. No rallying cry, just the roar of the engine as Dale slammed the Sherman into reverse, the treads grinding back, mud spraying from under the hull. From the outside, any watching officer would have seen a tank breaking doctrine, reversing out of assigned position without clearance, abandoning a forward-firing stance. But inside the tank, something different happened. Foster's gun adjusted to match the rollback, barrel tracking with machine precision. Levine's hands moved on instinct, loading armor-piercing rounds smooth as a factory assembly line. Riker cut battalion chatter from his headset, switching to local tank intercom only. The crew sealed themselves into their own separate world of motion, one not tied to radio orders, but to survival mathematics. As the Sherman slid back into the angled ditch, its profile lowered, hull slanted, gun now facing across the hedgerow line, not down the lane. To the Panzer spotters observing through narrow optics, the Sherman vanished from expected sight line. A German loader hesitated, confused. A Panzer commander adjusted his view, thinking a second Sherman had appeared to the flank that moment. That single beat of enemy hesitation was the birth of what would later be whispered among German tank crews as the Phantom Sherman. And all of it began because one man broke a single word. Hold June 29th, 1944, 05:28 hours. The Sherman lurched backward into the ditch with a violent jolt, treads churning up earth as the hull angled sharply. From the outside, it looked clumsy, disordered, a panicked retreat. But inside the tank, the movement was exact, controlled with the precision of a machinist guiding a steel component into alignment. The Panzer gunners, expecting a static target in the open lane, had already begun adjusting their optics. They anticipated the Sherman would hold its forward stance, present its frontal armor, and trade shots until one of them died. Instead, the American tank vanished from the expected arc. "Where the hell are they?" German radio chatter from the Panzer platoon. Intercepted later in the day, Harlan's Sherman settled into the angled depression, hull slightly canted, giving it what tankers would later call an improvised reverse slope advantage. From this position, only a small portion of the turret was visible, and the gun now faced directly across the hedgerow line. Not down the lane, inside the tank, time narrowed. "Target! Left ridge. Mark 3 degrees, Harlan said. Voice like iron. 3 degrees left. On, Foster confirmed, hand firm on the traverse crank. AP loaded, Levine breathed, his voice low, eyes locked forward, even though he couldn't see the target. "Driver." "Hold steady," Harlan said. And Dale did. His hands, which had been shaking minutes earlier, were now still as stone for a heartbeat. Everything went silent. Then, fire. The Sherman's 75mm gun kicked back with a brutal metallic shriek, the entire turret recoiling as the shells screamed across the short distance, striking the Panzer IV not in its thick front plate, but across its exposed right flank. Just above the suspension, the German tank lurched violently, smoke bursting from the hit point as the crew scrambled. Surprised, they had not expected a flank engagement so soon, so close, and from that angle. A second Panzer, further up the line, rotated its turret too far in response, overcorrecting, expecting a second Sherman. From their optics, a reverse-moving tank suggested multiple vehicles withdrawing and repositioning. In reality, it was one tank, one decision. Hit confirmed. "They're panicking," Foster said, adrenaline sharpening his words. "Loader, next round." "Same angle," Harlan ordered. Levine slammed in another AP shell, the casing clanking against the breech. The Sherman's engine rumbled beneath them like a living thing, ready to surge or reverse as needed. Outside, German smoke grenades were being thrown. Standard Panzer doctrine when flanked. White plumes burst across the hedgerow like ghostly curtains, blinding both sides. But Harlan understood something about motion and steel. Smoke favored those who were already maneuvering. The stationary tank became lost prey. The moving tank became the unknown hunter. "Drive. 1 meter forward." "Nudge. Don't crest," Harlan commanded. Dale eased the Sherman forward, not enough to reveal the hull, but enough to shift the firing arc by just a hair. "Gunner. Adjust. Fire." Another shot. Another hit. The second Panzer stalled, its turret frozen mid-rotation. To the German infantry watching from further down the lane, it looked as though multiple Shermans were darting through the hedgerows, appearing at angles no doctrine had accounted for. But no, it was still one tank, one decision, one unauthorized maneuver rewriting the flow of armor combat in that corridor. For 37 seconds, the battlefield belonged not to doctrine, but to motion. Obergefreiter Karl Weiss, gunner of the lead Panzer IV, had fought in North Africa and on the Eastern Front. He had seen Shermans before, predictable machines, always pressing forward, never retreating except in full panic, and even then, doing so in straight lines that made them easy targets. What he saw now did not fit any pattern. The first Sherman had been sighted holding position at the end of the hedgerow lane, exactly as expected. Weiss had adjusted his optics for a frontal shot, elevation perfect, distance controlled. The kill felt certain even before the first shell left the barrel. Then it vanished. Not fully, just enough that the angle broke, enough that the front plate was gone, replaced by a fleeting shape angled wrong. Too low, too lateral, not retreating straight, but sliding, like a hunter circling rather than prey fleeing. Zweiter Panzer, another Sherman on left flank. A voice crackled over the net. But that didn't make sense. Weiss knew the terrain. There was no room for a second Sherman to maneuver like that without being seen entering the lane. Yet shells came from the side in rapid succession, striking the column with precise timing, as if coordinated by multiple tanks. Fear in experienced tankers does not announce itself. It creeps in through confusion. Smoke grenades were deployed, standard countermeasure. The air filled with thick, billowing white curtains, hiding the Sherman from view. That should have helped. It always helped. But this time, the smoke worked against them. Somewhere inside that shifting fog, the reverse maneuver had given the American tank a ghost-like signature. Each time Weiss adjusted his sight, the angle was wrong again, like the enemy tank was folding space, appearing where it should not be. The German radio net grew tense. Panzer Dreh. I see movement on the hedgerow crest. Negative. That's not possible. That ditch is too narrow. It moved. Swear to God, I saw it. It moved backwards and sideways. Backward and sideways. Not a retreat. A controlled slide, like a trained boxer stepping offline from a punch rather than simply stepping back. Weiss's commander, Lieutenant Rudolf Stahl, clenched his teeth. He recognized tactical maneuver, but this was doctrine abandonment. American tanks did not fight like this. Is that an M10 tank destroyer? Stahl muttered, lowering his binoculars. Tank destroyers were the only U.S. units trained in rapid reverse flanking. No, sir, Weiss whispered. Sherman chassis. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then came the quiet line Weiss would later write in his after-action report. The American tank fought like a prowling animal, not a machine bound by orders. The third Panzer in the line, lacking visual clarity, fired blind into the smoke, hoping to pin the unseen enemy. The shell went wide. Panic fire. The first sign that discipline was cracking. Inside their armor, German tankers felt something new. Not fear of being outgunned, but fear of facing something that did not follow the rules, something that moved in angles they had not trained against. A mechanical phantom slipping between hedgerows as if guided by instinct, not command. And that fear, more than armor thickness or gun velocity, fractured their rhythm. In 37 seconds, the battle had shifted from armored doctrine to psychological warfare, and all from a single reverse maneuver. By the time the smoke cleared and the infantry finally secured the lane, the hedgerow corridor was a graveyard of twisted metal. 2 Panzer IVs lay crippled, their hulls still smoldering, tracks blown apart. A third had been abandoned intact, its crew having fled under the confusion of smoke and shifting gunfire, believing they had stumbled into a multi-tank ambush. But there had only been one Sherman. The surviving American units, arriving late and out of breath, found Harlan's tank half submerged in the ditch, still angled in that strange position. Neither retreat nor advance, but something else entirely. A stance of calculated defiance. 10.15. Hours. Battalion Field Briefing. Makeshift Tent Headquarters. Captain Miller, who had not seen the maneuver but had only listened to radio chaos, slammed a stack of reports down on a folding table. Who authorized that reverse movement? Who pulled that tank off axis? The communications officer, pale and exhausted, shifted uncertainly. No authorization, sir. Sherman 3-4 moved on its own. Moved on its own. In military language, that meant insubordination. Harlan and his crew were pulled from their tank and brought under canvas for debrief interrogation, not commendation. Their uniforms were still streaked with oil and soil from the ditch. They had the look of men who had survived something not yet understood by those questioning them. Captain Miller's tone was cold. Sergeant Harlan, do you understand that reversing without command clearance constitutes a breach of armored doctrine under Section 4B? Harlan did not defend himself. He simply recited the mechanical conditions as if reading off a tool calibration sheet. Panzer barrels high on ridge. Depression insufficient. We were visible. Angle unfavorable. Had we held rotation, round would have penetrated through the lower glacis. Reverse slope corrected that. The captain stared at him. We don't make decisions in the field based on personal interpretations of mechanical angles, Sergeant. You follow orders. There was silence. Harlan didn't speak. The air in the tent felt heavy. Then, unexpectedly, a lieutenant from the Armor Assessment Unit stepped forward, holding a pair of field binoculars and a clipboard. Sir, with respect, I reviewed the hull impact marks. The Sherman would have been destroyed in the first 30 seconds if it held position facing forward. The reverse angle dropped their profile 6 degrees. The Panzers shot overshot by that exact margin. Captain Miller hesitated. The tent fell quiet. For a long moment, doctrine and reality stood opposed. Ink on paper versus scars on steel. Miller finally exhaled, slow and restrained. And the two Panzers? The lieutenant's voice remained calm, professional, neutralized, from flank angle. That position was only possible from reverse ditch alignment. No standard formation could achieve that without turning the entire column. In the silence that followed, the weight of what had happened began to settle. A forbidden maneuver had worked, not out of recklessness, but out of mechanical logic. The captain said nothing more. He dismissed the crew without commendation, without reprimand. As Harlan stepped out of the tent, he heard two junior officers whispering over the battle reports. What do we call that move? It doesn't have a name. It isn't in the manual. Maybe it should be. The official after-action report did not mention reverse ditch maneuver or flanking thrust achieved by non-standard withdrawal. It used sterile language. Sherman 3-4 repositioned under pressure and engaged enemy armor to advantage, as if it had been a routine affair. But soldiers do not pass down sterile language. They pass down memory, and memory spread. By the second week of July, tank crews from other companies were quietly asking Harlan's driver how he had managed to reverse the Sherman without throwing a track. Others asked Foster how he held target acquisition during a lateral slide. Some didn't ask questions. They simply repeated what they'd heard from passing infantry. There's a Sherman up there. The Germans thought it was two tanks. The Germans, too, had spoken. Prisoners captured days later during infantry sweeps near St. Lo reported something strange. We were told an American tank was moving. Wrong. Not like others. Your tanks always come forward. This one fought as if it was hunting. No officer wrote that down. But the infantry did not forget it. August 1944. Unofficial notes. Armor training platoons. England. In the margins of field manuals. Drawn in pencil by hands that would never sign an official document, someone sketched an arrow sliding backward at an angle. With a note beside it, reverse side shift, reduces target plate. Chatetifs. Forces enemy turret rotation. Try if pinned. It wasn't a doctrine. Not yet. It was a whisper. In training yards in England, new Sherman crews began experimenting when instructors weren't watching, testing how far they could safely reverse before the suspension groaned, calculating how much arc they could gain without exposing side armor. Some failed, throwing tracks into soft mud. Others learned to feel the ditch the way Harlan's driver had, not by sight, but by machine instinct. One evening, a young lieutenant overseeing an exercise saw a Sherman deliberately angle itself while reversing under mock fire. He stormed toward the crew, ready to deliver a reprimand, until he heard one of the trainees mutter, "They called it the Phantom Sherman move." "Happened near St. Lo." The lieutenant paused, said nothing, walked away. German intelligence report. September 1944 captured field notes from a Panzer Grenadier unit retreating toward the Siegfried Line included an entry written in rushed, unpolished German. American tank maneuvered backward into cover, flank firing. Doctrine unclear. Their crews now react faster than before. We must assume some have begun ignoring standing orders. To the Allied intelligence officer translating the note, it was dismissed as a curiosity, but to those who had been in the hedgerows, it was confirmation. The enemy had noticed. Winter 1944, doctrinal update weeks later. In a confidential appendix to an armored engagement manual circulated among field officers, not published for public eyes, a new line appeared beneath a diagram of Sherman positioning. In restricted terrain, a reverse lateral reposition may create unexpected enfilade advantage. Use at commander discretion. It wasn't credited. No names were attached. But to those who had sat in St. Lo that morning, inside an M4 Sherman angled in a ditch, that single line was enough. They had not been commended. They had not been celebrated. They had simply survived and changed tank doctrine by 6 degrees and 37 seconds. Years later, long after the hedgerows had been cleared and the fields of Normandy returned to farming silence, William Harlan stood at the edge of that same lane, now just another quiet road bordered by trimmed shrubs and new growth. No smoke, no engines, no panzer treads cutting through the earth, only the faint hum of distant tractors and the wind moving through grass that had once hidden fire and steel. He crouched and laid a hand on the soil where his tank had reversed into the ditch. The earth had filled in, healed, as if war had never carved its mark here. War erases itself from land quicker than it erases itself from memory. Foster had gone back to Boston. Levine never spoke of tanks again and lived the rest of his life painting sunsets no one understood. Dale, the driver, worked freight trucks in Kansas, and every time he reversed a vehicle, he checked the mirrors twice, feeling for angles that no one else could see. Riker, the radio man, went silent after the war and never owned another radio. None of them wore medals for that morning. No commendation existed for breaking orders and living. No citation honored reverse maneuvers or 6-degree ditch angles. History rarely writes down the names of men who survive by thinking instead of obeying. Harlan stood, looking at the sunken road stretching out before him, imagining once more the crushing sound of panzer treads, the hiss of smoke grenades, the clatter of the Sherman's gears as Dale threw it into reverse, not as retreat, but as attack from an unexpected vector. He did not smile. He simply spoke, though no one was there to hear. A tank that holds still is already dead. And as the wind moved through the hedgerow, like a breath taken after too long, a final truth settled over the field like mist returning. In war, obedience keeps you in line, but sometimes breaking a rule is the only way to stay alive.